to introduce Sara Gregg, who's a professor in both history and environmental studies here at KU. And I think it's just a real treat to have an environmental historian talk to us today. I've followed kind of Sara's work for some time now. I don't think she knows that, but I have. And I just thought I'd share that she's published 2 books. One of them is on the Appalachian Mountains and looking at federal policies and the New Deal and how that affected land management and use. She also was part of a group who co-authored a book on agriculture in America, with essays going from Thomas Jefferson all the way up to Michelle Obama's White House Gardens. And she's also published several journal articles. But what she's going to talk about today, I think, is on the several homestead acts that occurred with settlers coming into this part of the country and all the challenges with agriculture, native lands, politics, you name it, and looking at the effect of that on the environment. And I think without further ado, take it away, Sara.
Okay, thank you, Helen. So I am actually not going to be talking quite so much about the Homestead Acts per se. In fact, they get very short shrift in this talk, in part because I am really eager to share some conceptualizations with you, I suppose is the best way to frame it. And so I'm going to share my screen as I get started, and hopefully, wait a minute, I don't have a share screen function. Is there a way, Ben, that I can share? I have a bunch of slides. I don't actually have to have them as part of the presentation, so really just let me know.
So you don't have the button at all?
I don't have the button at all. Oh, yes, now I do.
Okay.
Just appeared.
I was just changing some options under advanced sharing, so hopefully.
Excellent. So let's see. The only question I have is how it will work. If somebody might need to walk me through how most effectively to, okay, let's see. I think show, I think I can do this, and you will only see the slides, right? Oh, good. Okay, excellent. So
we've got your notes there too. Is that okay?
You don't want to see my notes.
I just wanted to let you know before you started flipping through.
So let's see.
Maybe swap displays. Is that? Oh, that's it. You got it.
Excellent. Okay. So I'd like to open with a brief land acknowledgement because I think it is important to recognize that the University of Kansas resides on the ancestral territory of several tribal nations, including but not limited to the Kaw, Osage, and Shawnee peoples. And the university occupies land ceded in a 1825 treaty with the Kaw Nation and later treaty with the Shawnee enforced in 1854. And I think this is an important part of my talk today, not only because we all, I think, are trying to become more deeply embedded in the histories of these places, but also because it is a fundamental part of the work I am doing right now. So first of all, many thanks to all of you for being here. To Helen for having had the curiosity to invite me, and for Ben for facilitating today. I have found my trips to West Campus for meetings of this seminar to have been consistently generative over the years, and far too infrequent. So I'm especially grateful to those of you who made it here to Zoom today under these most unusual circumstances. And I've really been looking forward to this conversation for more than a year now. I also want to express my gratitude to the larger community of scientists here at KU. When Don Worster first asked me if I would consider returning to the Midwest, which was actually his word, not mine, I never could have imagined how significantly the community of biologists, in particular at KU, would reshape my thinking, my research, and my scholarship. So it has been transformative for me to visit the research sites on campus with Bob Hagan, to engage in conversation with Kelly Kincher and his students about ethnobotany and ways of knowing the histories of the Great Plains through indigenous experience, to take a class on native bees with Deb Smith, and to collaborate with the Land Institute, to learn from folks in the Beaver Schultz Lab, and from the staff of the Spencer Museum of Art, especially Joey Orr and Silke Strand. So this has been really a way that my research has evolved in truly unimaginable ways, and I'm really looking forward to getting your feedback on some of these ideas. So as you can see from my opening slide, I want to talk about the idea of a monolith as a tool that I am borrowing from the natural sciences. Okay, hold on just a second. It's not letting me, okay. To advance my own research agenda. And so I want to come to you as a US historian, and in the process of today's talk, problematize this really beautiful Currier and Ives lithograph called Across the Continent, which has this sort of breakdown of civilization on the left-hand side and nature and indigenous people on the right-hand side, separated by technology, bringing society forward. And it is in part because of this sort of simplistic, progressive narrative of history that has dominated and been contested over the last several decades that I really wanted to begin using new ideas to shape my inquiries as an environmental historian. And so in the process, I have appropriated methods and language from the natural sciences. And we all know, I think, or you should know, that humanists are great appropriators. We take a little bit of theory here, a little bit of art there, here's my art, a smattering of geology or climate science to round it out. But I do believe there is something fundamentally useful for historians and other social scientists and humanists to taking an interdisciplinary approach to change over time, especially if we acknowledge that human and natural history unfold in tandem, often forcing us to meander through what seems to be, as this image suggests, a clear course. So with that, here we go. I cannot recall exactly what it was that brought me to the Spencer Museum of Art for a gallery talk on terra anima. It was in the fall of 2017, I've realized, and Dan Hermes was talking about the monoliths he had gathered with a research team from the Kansas River floodplain. The aesthetic resonance of these images, of course, is compelling, and it was memorable. But what really struck me and stuck with me was the concept of morphological order and how it can be used for explanatory purposes. Now, my notes from that talk have been buried in a pile under my desk in Wesco, which is, I think, pretty appropriate. Although this week, as I was thinking about this particular presentation, I think I remember where I wrote them down and on what kind of paper, which means I may actually find them again. But this detail actually fits in with the larger theme of this talk, the ways in which connecting ideas and evidence often feels haphazard and relies on what seems to be fortuitous accidents. So the book I'm writing right now is called, it's called Little Piece of Earth. Oh, there we go. The Hidden History of the Homestead Era. And as Helen suggested, it is about the various iterations of federal land law as they sought to, quote, open up the West for Euro-American settlement. And here's where I have uncovered, if you will, the utility of using the metaphor of the monolith to situate my research on landscape history. Because I have been working to recenter, or actually to decenter, the human in my research. And my interest in adaptation as a strategy for survival in this current era has made me especially susceptible to this type of thinking. Yet I share the hesitation of my colleague, John McNeil, who recently gave a presidential address to the American Historical association that both encouraged interdisciplinarity for historians and reflected on its perils. So McNeill wrote, quote, "Many scholars, myself included, are too often guilty of skating over the thin ice of unfamiliar disciplines. We tend to seek simplification, understandably, and to engage in oversimplification at times. We are guilty of an equivalent of seeing like a state and imposing a legibility upon the chaotic and the messy, for otherwise we can't use the results of our colleagues' exciting work. There are limits to what we know and understand due to the finiteness of our training and our lifetimes." And McNeill went on to talk about the ways in which he believes that historians will begin to rely on new forms of information rather than simply the paper record, parchment records, or papyrus records upon which so many historians have relied over the last decades and centuries, frankly. So many historians have written about history as a palimpsest, as a, quote, as a type of a manuscript upon which original writing has been effaced to make room for later writing. And yet the traces of those earlier pieces of writing remain. And for decades, historians of the United States followed in the footsteps of Frederick Jackson Turner, who had asserted that as European settler colonists crossed the continent rather methodically, they brought layers of civilization into the wilderness, in the process rewriting history and shaping the US nation state. But I want to push back against Turner's understanding, as many generations of scholars have now, while also arguing that the idea of the palimpsest does capture the value of rewriting human experience in new ways. But I think it's instead the idea of a monolith that allows scholars to better visualize how each era of use, modification, and understanding adds its own complexity to place. And I do believe that these things can be excavated in our search for understanding the broader role of natural systems and human communities on the land. And so I love this, this excerpt from a 1908 publication written by an American socialist, J.A.M. Simmons, who was asserting that the tragedies of the US West fill this history of this era of settlement and dispersal. Okay, so I'm going to leave you with some images for a while. So yes, I seek to appropriate scientific knowledge to contextualize historical change over time. In its current form, my research uses the idea of the monolith in several forms. I've been working to interweave John Weaver's monoliths, the trenches he pioneered to explore root networks in the dense prairie ecosystems, with Hermis's monoliths as ways of evoking the complexity and the beauty of soil horizons, as well as the types of monoliths that graduate student Theo Michael uses as she aspires to seed the regeneration of depleted, modified grasslands, basically inoculating the soil with soil cores that are moved from healthy prairie ecosystems. But I really started thinking about this concept using Weaver's description of the Great Plains, which I think evokes far more than his prairie plants, as we can all recognize. And in his 1968 book, Prairie Plants and the Environment, he wrote, "The beauty and quiet calm of the grassland should not obscure the fact that the prairie is both a field of battle that is centuries old and a field in which the conflicting species, never wholly victorious nor entirely vanquished, each year renew the struggle. There is a bitter struggle for mere existence, for light, water, and nutrients, all of which are eagerly sought by numerous competitors." And Weaver's lab helped to unearth the complex networks integral to the grasslands ecosystem, and they introduced a new method by which the sample of an entire root system may be taken. So what was beautiful about this is that the system can be separated from the soil without injuring the roots and with only slight displacement from their natural position, and then it brings into the laboratory the various horizons of the soil profile. As Weaver wrote, the monolith method is of great value in comparing root development and the activities of roots in various soil types and all levels. And the other value is that it reveals the continuity of roots as well as its relationship of those of one species to those of another, which I'm using as a segue into my work. I hope my research emphasizes both the often unpredictable ways in which environmental factors mediate social relations and the ways in which the competition for natural resources often incites discrimination, violence, and disorder, not only within human communities, but also within natural systems. And so my book, Little Piece of Earth, The Hidden History of the Homestead Era, revisits a mythologized aspect of US history, which is often thought of as the expansion of the US nation state and the movement of settler colonists through the trans-Mississippi West in search of what they thought of as free land. So the policy history of this project opens with the passage of the 1862 Homestead Act, when Congress institutionalized the exchange of land for labor. And it is deeply entwined with the tumult of the contact zone and a crucial moment in indigenous removal, as well as the radical expansion of federal scientific mapping and the emergence of new environmental challenges that manifested in specific ways in the Trans-Missouri West. So while the idea of opportunity that was embedded in the promise of a homestead was prototypically American, so was the disorder associated with the implementation of this straightforward government program on the ground. The grand narrative of the homestead era remains to be written, and that is my ambition with this book. And yet in the process, I have gone down some pretty unexpected paths. So here, just to again resituate us in the transitions of these landscapes, I want to emphasize the metamorphosis of the American prairie from the tumultuous early years of the 19th century through the present, which I see as a new era of transformation and transformative migration across the Great Plains. The project encompasses the shifting indigenous understandings of place, the contingencies of the contact zone, and the ways in which settler colonists encountered this land as a place of constant flux. This project emphasizes both the significance of natural history and environmental conditions for the course of human history, as well as the geomorphological and hydrological systems, the climatic patterns, and the plant-animal associations of this region of short grass and limited rainfall. And so I'm orienting you to this in part through four movements, and they are represented by the four peaks, first in yellow, then in green, gray, and orange. The moments of highest successful final homestead proofs in the West. And these took place, all of them on the Great Plains, in Kansas in 1878, in Oklahoma in 1901, North Dakota in 1908, and Montana in 1917. And so I'm using these peaks as my point of entry. And then I am basically digging down from there, if you will, seeking to capture the diverse and compelling landscapes of the Great Plains, as well as the varying land use and land management regimes, as well as the sights and the sounds of the Great Plains as they altered human and other species experiences over time. So Little Piece of Earth is, again, oriented around these four most successful movements across the West, but each movement is centered on a single square mile section. And that section was proved up by a homesteader in one of these years of peak homestead proof. But I sort of go deeper down into the history of that place and the broader region using a series of layers, I suppose, in the true form of a monolith. And my attempt is to layer the stories of the transformation of these landscapes alongside the transformations of indigenous nations and the US nation state. And it results in a 16-chapter set of monoliths that are designed to help us understand the history of land transformation on the Great Plains. Each of these movements excavates the very discrete set of conditions that confronted the various species making a home on this square mile section. And while the monoliths are inherently place-specific, they also accommodate the broader context of ecological changes that took place more broadly, as well as the political and social changes that took place as various groups of humans sought to establish mastery over the land. So the various and sundry inconstancies of weather and the micro associations of plants and animals species on the Great Plains means that while it is possible to paint the landscape with a broad brush, the acre by acre reality is in fact much more determinative than we tend to recognize. As Wallace Stegner wrote in his famous 1960 wilderness letter, on our Saskatchewan prairie, the nearest neighbor was 4 miles away, and at night we saw only 2 lights on all the dark rounding earth. The earth was full of animals, field mice, ground squirrels, weasels, ferrets, badgers, coyotes, burrowing owls, snakes. I knew them as my little brothers, as fellow creatures, and I have never been able to look upon animals in any other way since. The sky in that country came clear down to the ground on every side, and it was full of great weathers and clouds and winds and hawks. I hope I learned something from looking a long way, from looking up, from being very much alone. And so it's this sort of exquisite attunement to place that I believe offers insights into the cumulative effects of landscape change and the seasons in this land of grasses. So I argue that contrary to many travelers' descriptions of dull, unchanging expanses, this place seizes opportunity, blossoming at the slightest provocation, fading to tonal shades when the rains pause. For some, especially when rains are scarce and water supplies far distant, the challenges of the climate are unyielding. But more noticeably, hundreds of animal species have made their way across the plains. And in this book, I use 4 native species to orient the reader more intimately to place. Not the sort of charismatic bison, but rather a couple of more what I call keystone mutualists, the coyote, the prairie rattlesnake, the red-winged blackbird, and the great northern bumblebee. And it's in part because my reading of the scientific literature has helped me to understand how local environments have forced the adaptation of generations of other creatures beyond humans as they have sought over the millennia to make a place for themselves on these lands. And so I open each of my monoliths with a chapter that sets the physical stage for other changes on the landscapes of the plains. Each uses the life cycle of a native species to situate the ways in which the fauna of the plains experience place. But these chapters are not designed to be perspectival. I'm not trying to, quote, be a bat, but rather I want these lyric essays to orient the reader to a sensory experience of place. Because these creatures have never experienced their world through the lens of human decision-making. And their survival offers us an alternative perspective on adaptation and resilience in the face of an often changing environment. So while some species like the bison are a cultural keystone of the Great Plains, I'm using other less charismatic species, species that are deeply embedded in the nature of the place. By using these animals to orient us, I have sought to decenter the approach to environmental history, of exploring other ways of knowing place in order to move beyond the human and the visuals. So there's a lot of human history, especially settler colonial history in this. Oh, wow. I don't remember this folding back. Okay. In this book. But essentially, I'm using these sort of evocations of place as I said, an orientation. Moving beyond natural history, though, I'm also taking a micro-historical approach to landscape, biography, and environmental change, which allow me to explore what historian Jill Lepore once described as the history of hitherto, I'm going back to this for a while. Hold on, let's see if I can pause this slide. Okay, the hitherto obscure people and places that concentrate on an intensive study of particular lives and landscapes in order to invoke a period, a mentality, a problem. So my attention is focused on the monumental history of land transfers on the American prairie, a transformation that took rolling grasslands into new forms, from prairie to angular fields of domesticated grasses, to wheat, corn, and sorghum that fuel the economies of many states today. For me, the history of native dispossession is central to the growth of the nation state on these landscapes. And so I'm working to excavate and to contextualize the stories of displacement alongside the insertion of new systems of land categorization and distribution. And similarly, as I have long argued, homesteading has been implicated in all of the central questions of its age. So I've followed the conditions leading up to the opening of the homestead frontier alongside journeys of people from other places onto the Great Plains, seeking to tap into the zeitgeist, as well as the specific socioeconomic challenges of every homestead era. And part of my argument is that the drive to self-sufficiency and later for all of these creatures, and later the ambition on the part of settler colonists to claim quote unquote free land, allows us to understand some of the trade-offs that have accompanied the movement of species across depopulated, repopulated landscapes, uniting all of the individuals whose lives I have followed. And so I want to return to the structure of the monolith specifically as a means of concluding with a few final thoughts. And so the idea here, and this is where I really would like feedback from all of you soil scientists and ecologists and evolutionary biologists, I see this as really making sense as metaphor and as a method actually for me in this project, because just as soils are, quote, replete with their own shifting structures and teeming with cultural associations to our real, remembered, and imaginary places in the world, as the Terra Anima exhibit catalog conveyed, I keep returning to the ways in which Dan Hermes described the development with time of these soils, as well as how they have been altered as key to understanding both geographic and geological knowledge. And I want to insist that the histories that we create from the lives we make on these soils can offer a lens into new ways of knowing place. So this talk represents my effort to make and to circulate knowledge more broadly as part of a larger community of researchers, acknowledging that knowledge production is not static. So I want to acknowledge that, like these mountain goat kids, I am in some precarious territory today. And so I'm going to close actually with a few photographic puns. These mountain goat kids butting up against the limits of disciplinary knowledge and practice. But I also want to emphasize that I am trying to avoid being fenced in by the constraints of professional boundaries, because I am truly eager. I don't know why this keeps doing this. I am really eager to hear your thoughts on the ways in which I have framed my thinking about how to narrate human and natural history using the structure of the monolith, as well as the frameworks created by natural scientists as a means of informing humanistic inquiry. So that's the end of my technical difficulties as well as my talk. I really welcome piercing critiques, corrections, suggestions, etc., because I do truly want to see whether these constructs make sense to a community of natural scientists and artists and humanists more broadly, as opposed to just my little person sitting in my garden thinking big thoughts or trying to think big thoughts. So again, thank you so much for coming, and I look forward to hearing your feedback.
Yay, good job, that was amazing. I'm just going to stop the recording now, and then we can have questions, and there'll be more freedom after the recording stops.
Great, thank you. And